Hey everyone, Logan here from the Spalty Dog. So today I'm going to show you how I made this mid-century modern plant stand. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the build.
I start out by cutting some 5/4 maple to rough length, then square it up using the joiner, planer, and table saw. I lay out the boards for the shelves. To make sure there are no gaps in the glue seam, I use the in-out method by marking each board and taking a shallow pass on the joiner. I'll put a link in the description of a good video explaining this. Then I glue up each shelf using a few clamps and set them aside to dry. Next, I cut the legs to final length with a 5-degree angle at the miter saw. I cut out each leg on the table saw using the Rockler tapering jig. Then I added a smaller taper to the top of each leg using my miter gauge. After that, I ripped the stretchers for the legs to final width. With my miter gauge set to 5 degrees, I referenced the miter bar against the edge of my workbench to position the first leg, then clamp it in place. I repeated this process for the second leg after roughly measuring the distance between each leg. Next, I attach a couple plywood scraps directly to my workbench on the outside of each leg to act as a fence. To get the exact spacing, I can slide the legs up and down the plywood fences attached to my workbench. With everything in place, I attached another plywood scrap as a positive stop. To make sure my legs are on the same level plane, I checked that the bottom of each leg was fully seated on the stop. Now I can start marking and cutting the stretchers over at the miter saw. Since the angle from the tapering jig is random, I sneak up on it by tapping the miter saw over a little at a time. To cut the stretchers to final length, I need to mark and transfer the lines to the opposite face. It's important to check the angle on your miter saw before cutting each stretcher to ensure the best fit. Next, I do a quick test fit to make sure the stretchers will line up on each pair of legs, then mark their location. I decided to use dowel joinery for the stretchers, so I made easy work of it with this self-centering doweling jig. Now some of you might say, but Logan, I don't have a doweling jig. And that's okay, a domino joiner would work great here as well. To transfer the dowel locations to the legs, I use dowel centers which leave small indentations in the wood. When drilling the dowel holes on the legs, I made them slightly larger for an easier assembly. I ended up only using one dowel on each end as I found it was much easier to align everything. Next, I smooth all the edges using the belt sander since it'll be more difficult to sand after assembly. The glue up for this was pretty straightforward. I made some 5-degree clamping cauls and they made it extremely easy to apply pressure on the angled legs. I also added F-clamps at each of the joints to keep everything as flat as possible. I came back the next day and milled the shelves down to their final thickness with the planer and sanded everything up to 180 grit. Then I lay out the shelves using a brass spacer bar and mark their locations on each set of legs. Next I add a 5-degree bevel on the front edge of each shelf over the table saw. After that, I measure and mark how far I want to inset the shelves. Then I can measure the depth and cut each down to size with the same 5-degree bevel. When attaching the shelves, I repeat the same process as earlier with the doweling jig and dowel centers. Next, I round over all the edges with my trim router. I'll be using a water-based finish for this piece, so I raised the grain, then sanded everything with 220 to help with a smoother finish. I had some burning from the router, so I cleaned that up as well. The final glue up took a little more persuasion than the first, but after getting all the dowels lined up and everything close, I could let the clamps do most of the work to pull everything together. The mallet left a few marks on the stand, so I had to come back and do a little more sanding. I also put a light chamfer on the feet to prevent them from chipping out. After that, I cleaned the base with mineral spirits and started spraying the finish. I decided to try Minwax polyacrylic for this piece because I wanted something that wouldn't yellow the wood over time. I applied multiple thin coats while wet sanding in between with 600 grit. All that's left to do is get some plants on this guy and we can call this one finished. Our house is slowly being overrun by my wife's plants, so when I asked her if I could make a plant stand for her, she was all for it. We're both really happy with how this turned out, and the maple is a great break from all the darker wood in the house. Thanks for sticking around so far, and if you liked the video, consider liking and subscribing to stay up to date on future projects. I hope to catch you on the next one.